Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, I'll be talking about Traitor's Blade by Sebastian de Castell, the first book in the Greatcoats series. And I know, it's about time I finally got to this one. It's been on my list for quite some time, something I've meant to do. I've, of course, starting with Alan from the Library of Alexandria, have heard all kinds of great things about this. I know a lot of people have read it, really enjoyed it. There's definitely several people I know who love the series in the Discord who've been on me to read it, and so I finally did read it. It has been read, and I did quite enjoy this one, even though it did turn out to be a bit different than what I expected. So let's talk about the book, because this, like I said, did turn out a little bit different. And I expected, the kind of the swashbuckling, the witty banter, the friendship between our three main characters. Falkio, our main character, but then the two others, Kest and Brasti. And so I know this is done in kind of the vein of the Three Musketeers. That's pretty obvious. And it runs through, some of the same notes. It's incredibly different, I will say. And it's not trying to be like a modern Three Musketeers per se, but it definitely has kind of that feel in some ways, with just the kind of the adventuring, the friendship between the three, the emotional moments put in, all that kind of thing is definitely in there. But while we do get a lot of the witty banter, the humor, we almost, especially toward the beginning, almost go from chapter to chapter, from like humorous, witty banter to very serious and like more emotional and a little bit darker in tone. And so that happens right off the bat, and it starts with where we have the main timeline, what's actually happening, and then we flip back to hearing about Falkio's past, or him telling stories, explaining things, and that has a much more serious tone. So I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting more of the former, not so much of the latter, but I think it worked pretty well in really introducing everything of how it's going on. When you have Falkio narrating as well, especially for those parts, he's kind of explaining all the things, and you're seeing, even though we're having lighthearted characters and who they are, we're also seeing that there's a lot more going on in the world as well. And so it kind of shows the complexity of Falkio as a character, and we're able to learn a lot of backstory in a very still interesting way through that. So it's one of those things where it can be hit or miss if it works, if we have stuff like that where the narrator, in this case who is Falkio, going back and explaining things. Sometimes it doesn't work, but the way that it's done narratively for me, I thought worked really well. And all in all, this book definitely was darker than I expected it to be. Like I said, I was expecting more lighter hearted, especially in some latter parts where we introduce different characters, have things going on. Granted, I mean, somebody gets murdered almost immediately at the start, so I suppose despite the humor, there was things going on like that from the start, to be fair. But it's just in general, it does flip-flop, but it doesn't feel like, oh, this is really jarring to go from this to that. It happens early on right away and kind of gives you that expectation. And so as it continues throughout, I think it did work. We get a little more serious as we go along, but there's still plenty of banter and great things happening going along in general. And the world that's set up is pretty interesting as well, because we have the series titular characters, the Greatcoats, who are originally were like the king's basically traveling judges, and they're highly trained not only to fight but to judge disputes, to do all of these different kind of things, and are like arbiters of the king's justice. And they were an organization, they were disbanded hundreds of years ago, and then the most recent king had brought them back and had kind of started up the Greatcoats again. But as we kind of learn through the events that happen, the Greatcoats are now fallen out of grace. They no longer are looked at with honor. They're called Tattercloaks or Tratari, both negative things about them, and so they're kind of roaming and just kind of trying to get by while still trying to fulfill the king's last orders is kind of the premise of this book. So we're not just given the kind of the, oh, hey, we're going to run around and go on adventures. There's a lot more of a serious plot, and the history that's set up is interesting. We're in a world where there's each duke kind of just runs their own show and has absolute power within their dukedom. And there's definitely a lot of plotting going on as well. and they pretty much all have great reason to not want to see the Greatcoats ever come back into power, because they don't want anyone who can come in and basically take away any shred of their power. We see the characters who have their darker moments of their past as well, and get developed there pretty well. And then we're setting up what seems to be, too, because, it is still a fantasy novel, the fantastical elements are more teased in this book, is what I would say. We definitely get some, but it feels like we're going to get a lot more the further we get into the series, because there's some things that are set up that we don't get a ton of information on, but that it'll be really interesting to see where they go. There definitely are some fantasy elements here. A lot of it does read as more of just like an adventure novel, and it is in a different world and everything as well. Of course, it's still fantastical in that sense, but it's fairly grounded at times, and then we'll jump into very fantastical at some other times as well. So kind of once again, playing between those two different tones. We have the light, the funny, and the more dark, and we have the very grounded, and then we have the very fantastical. I think it's blended all in all to be a very good book. Now, I did have some complaints here, and most of my complaints came from later in the book. It started out really good, and I did really enjoy this book, and I think I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. So something I really did enjoy, and I really liked, but there were some things that just seemed like it went a little far in trying to be like the dark and gritty and edgy. There was one particular kind of villain who just seemed almost like a caricature, because it was just like, I'm the epitome of evil and cruelty. And it felt like it went a little far. There was also, I had been told to expect a very specific thing that's in the book that just really had no place there, and I completely agree. And I'll get into that in a little more detail in the spoiler section. But so some parts just seemed like it went a little bit further than I think was strictly necessary. The other thing, and this is something that because of it's usually done in the lighter tone parts, I was willing to look past a little bit because it was doing it more in a fun way, but Castell does have a tendency to do the, and then this happened, but I'm not going to tell you how thing. And it's even done extremely tongue-in-cheek. At one point, there's a battle, and we're told like, oh, this person overcame the odds, and then we get the narration of, but I don't think it's even worth telling you what happened to them. They're so unimportant. So we'll get things like that, but it does happen a few times at even somewhat very pivotal scenes at times where we don't actually get to see what happens. We just see the aftermath. And that's one of those things that really does get to annoy me if it's used too much. I think it was towing the line here, so I'll be curious to see if that continues in the later books or done more. I have heard that the actual fighting and the fencing is supposed to be very realistic here, so I'm hoping that we don't have a ton of that. And we do definitely get action sequences where we learn a lot more. A really fun thing that the author does throughout is we learn about all of these little nicknames for different maneuvers or tricks that the Greatcoats have that they use to fight, different ways to fight different people, ways to fight unarmed, down to how to get an arrow out of yourself without making noise. There's all of these just little things that make the Greatcoats not only feel like, oh, this was definitely like this organization, it makes them feel depth because they have all these tips and tricks from over the years, but also develops our 3 main characters much closer to each other as well, and really shows that camaraderie, like, oh, we like to call it this, and so those things still really, really worked for me, but I do tend to get annoyed if it's overused with just not telling us what happens in those pivotal moments or not showing it. It usually, to me, seems like I didn't know how to write this scene, so I didn't, and so that is still, a minor complaint, but it didn't bother me as much as it sometimes does. I think it really depends on the book, how much it's used, if it's abused, if that actually bothers me or not. From there, I do want to get into some spoiler talk as well, because there are a few other things I wanted to talk about, both positive and negative in it as well. And so I'm going to get into some spoilers. So check out for the tag if you do not want spoilers, and you can skip past to the kind of final thoughts section. But from this point until then, there will be some spoilers. So the first thing, because the couple of big things, and I kind of mentioned and alluded to in the non-spoiler that I want to talk about that are negatives for me. The first was with the Duchess Patriana, who just really did, like I said, feel almost like a cartoon villain at points, because she's just like, I am the ultra cruel and genius. Her ending, I didn't feel like just gave a whole lot of satisfaction. And just with the, like torturing people and manipulating everything and the tortured horse and feeding people to the tortured horse, it just like, it got a little bit ridiculous for me. And I still I didn't necessarily hate it, but that's where I think too, part of that was just we were going too far into the dark and not into any of the humorous. I did notice that seems to once again also be done very intentionally with the character of Falkio, though, where he can kind of get into that depressed state, thinking about the past, and go there, and so that's kind of part of his character. So I think it made sense with the story to have that darker passage, but it did just at times seem to go a little bit far. The big thing which I thought was just not necessary is when we had the character Athalia, who's from the order of, I can't remember the name of the order specifically, but it's basically like an order of prostitute priestesses, which, that being a thing in general, was kind of weird. But then when she rapes the hurt out of Falkio, I did not care to read that, and I don't really see why that was necessary. And I'm sure some people would say, oh, it wasn't like that. I'm like, he said no a bunch of times and then finally gave in and seemed happy afterwards. But that was still messed up for a lot of reasons. Like I said, the core premise there, I assume that character is going to be relevant later on, but especially for this book, that was the entire purpose of that character. And I did not particularly care for that at all. But I do think, for the most part, it worked out well. The other thing is, I wish we wouldn't have had them split up like they did. It did end up, they meet back up. It was very satisfying with coming in and having, Castell and Brasti and the rest kind of save the day a little bit. And so I enjoyed that. I did love the Tailor as a character as well. I'm really interested, and that's another thing. The Tailor seems to have some sort of power as well, or might be a saint, since saints were mentioned are real things. But I'm curious to see how the Tailor seems to kind of know and have planned for everything, and the whole alluding to pulling the strings of the world. So interested to find more out there as well. That's another part of the fantastical elements. The fight with Cast fighting against the Saint of Swords, that was one of the offending where we don't actually get to see what happens kind of things. But after the jokes throughout of he said one day he's going to beat up the Saint of Swords because the Saint could probably use getting beat up a little bit, and then having him actually kill the Saint of Swords, that was funny. It did work for me. I wish we could have seen that scene, because I feel like that would have been a really cool scene to actually have written instead of having it off screen, but I did think it worked. So this was definitely a book that had some ups and downs for me, for sure. It wasn't consistently oh, this is amazing. There were some peaks and valleys, but overall a very fun and enjoyable book. It is the first book in a series too, so usually if I enjoy the first book in a series this much, and I've heard good things about the others, I guess occasionally you do get the series where the first book's good and then nobody likes the rest, but this has not been the case. People I've heard say that it gets better and better. So though I had some issues, I still really enjoy myself, and I am looking forward to continuing this series and reading the rest of it. I don't know when I'll get to it. I'm making no promises, but I can at least finally say I have read the first book in the Greatcoats series. I did enjoy it, so I'll be making sure to check this out and continue it along with the other million series that I have ongoing right now for it. But those are really my thoughts on Traitor's Blade, first book in the Greatcoats series by Sebastian de Castell. So let me know in the comments. I know a lot of people have read this, so let me know if you agree, disagree with anything that I said, what your thoughts were on this first book, and how badly you want me to keep reading in a timely fashion for the rest of the series, because I'm going to work on it. I promise I will. But it's just, I'm not sure exactly when I'll get to it. But I'd love to hear the comments, thoughts. You can definitely let me know in the comments. Make sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Of course, check out the Wizardly Duo Discord as well if you want to chat this book more, or other books, or really anything at all. It is a lot of fun, and we would love to have you. Of course, if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.